This is the second part of our study on the book of Leviticus. The previous session, we mentioned about how the book of Leviticus was likely written when the instruction was given. A lot of the instructions were given. There was always an introductory line that say, and God spoke to Moses. So the idea is that maybe Moses wrote them down immediately after he received it, and the whole entire book was written very, very early during the 1 month stay when they were in Mount Sinai. We mentioned that this whole study will be 4 parts, and today we're going to deal with the second part that will talk about the necessity of purification. This idea that most of us are very familiar with is called the atonement. But what is this atonement really all about? Why is there a need for atonement? So we know that previously in the first part of our study, we introduced to everyone the idea that the tabernacle has been completed. The presence of God is now on the tabernacle in the most holy place. And now because God's presence is now among the people, that means you can no longer just come to God in a very careless manner. There is a way you must come to God in a way that is appropriate. And that talks about the whole idea of the sacrifices. And even in the midst of all the sacrifices, you need a priest. You need the priesthood to represent you before God. You can't just barge into the holy presence and say, God, here am I. Okay, there's a lot of requirements. Because if you want to go into the holy presence, then you will have to bear all the heavy requirements. As it is, the priesthood are the one that bears with the heavy requirement so that they are able to bring your sacrifices and offer them on your behalf to God. So that was the whole idea of the tabernacle. That's the whole idea of all the different sacrifices and the priesthood. So after that whole entire discussion, especially in Leviticus chapter 10, where we talk about the importance of the priest because they are supposed to teach the people what is clean, what is unclean, and what is holy. And because of that teaching, that brings us to the next segment on Leviticus 11 all the way to 16. Why is there a need to clean the whole tabernacle, to cleanse it, to purify it? For you to clean and purify something, it presupposes that we do things that will pollute, that will make it unclean. So this is an idea. This whole portion will try to distinguish these 3 concepts in the Bible, in the Old Testament: unclean, clean, and holy. It is a very common misunderstanding that the opposite of holiness is not sinful. The opposite of holiness is simply common. What is common? What is available to all? What is holy means that it is dedicated, it is set apart. So in this whole entire segment, the book of Leviticus will distinguish all 3 kinds of things: unclean, clean, and holy. Okay, unclean, clean, and holy. So the whole book will first talk about what are the things, what are the 4 major areas that will introduce uncleanness. Okay, uncleanness or pollution or things that will make something unfit to be in the presence of God. That's the simplest way for us to understand uncleanness. Some condition that will make one person or an item unfit in the presence of God. What are the pollution that will come about because of uncleanness? And because of that pollution, therefore, there is a need for purification through what we know as the atonement sacrifice. This is one of the most important things in the book of Leviticus. Try to think about this. The book of Leviticus is the center book in the whole entire Pentateuch. And this whole chapter on atonement, Leviticus 16, is right smack in the middle of the whole book of Leviticus. The most central thing of the whole entire Pentateuch deals with how this atonement works. Okay, so this is something that we'll go through for this segment. So the first thing that the book introduces to us is the idea of pollution. These are the 4 areas that you are told will introduce pollution, uncleanness into the community. Animals, unclean animals. I'm quite sure most of us are very familiar with the idea. Unclean animals, clean animals. The second thing, childbirth. Childbirth introduces uncleanness into the community. Diseases, especially skin diseases, infectious diseases. And then finally, discharges from the human body. These 4 areas will bring about uncleanness into the community. The first one that the book emphasizes on is unclean animals. There is an important distinction, there's an important instruction to distinguish between there are some animals that is considered unclean and some animals that are considered as clean. And very simple, the instruction, clean food can be eaten, unclean food cannot be eaten. That's the basic idea. This is very different compared to all other uncleanness. Because in all other uncleanness, when the person is unclean, when you touch something that's unclean, for example, someone who is unclean because of childbirth, if you actually come into contact with that person, you become unclean. Because the person is unclean, you actually get affected, you get polluted by the uncleanness. But strangely, when you talk about unclean animals, there is no such restrictions. The only thing you're required not to do is not to eat, or in a way, not to accept unclean animals. Can you, for example, a camel is unclean. But can you ride a camel across the desert? Yes. Okay, it will not violate your cleanliness, your cleanness. Okay, riding a camel has no issues. You can get into contact with an unclean animal, you just can't eat them. We now know why this is true. Of course, in the early years, right, throughout the Old Testament, the Israelites are clueless about why this distinction. Why only animals? You have no such requirement to avoid them. When you go to the book of Acts chapter 10, where Peter was caught up into a trance and he saw the vision and about clean, unclean food, and then God gave him this idea. What God has made clean, let no man consider it unclean. And you notice in that distinction, all the while the people, the Christians suddenly understood all the while the idea of the clean, unclean food was meant to be a symbol of the Jew and Gentile divide. That the Jew, the clean people, is acceptable to God and the unclean people are not acceptable to God. So that was the idea of the distinction. So can the clean and the unclean people interact? Yes. But you cannot accept them, you cannot eat them, you cannot come into that close yoke with the unbeliever. But can you come into contact? Yes. So the clean, unclean animal was intended to let the people know that the whole creation is divided into this very simple, clear-cut division, clean and unclean. Clean and unclean. So the whole idea is to just avoid. Okay, avoid. But then constantly at the end of this segment, it does deal with the idea of uncleanness. The only uncleanness that will come out of animals at all is death. If you have a dead carcass, any form of dead animal, clean or unclean, it doesn't matter. Once there is death, there is uncleanness. So you notice that this instruction about the unclean animals is a little bit different compared to all other uncleanness. Subsequently, the rest of the instruction about uncleanness is very straightforward. Childbirth, for example, very clear instruction. How long will you be unclean after childbirth? Mainly because there is a discharge of blood in the midst of childbirth. So there's a period of uncleanness, and then after that period of uncleanness, you just need to bring some offering. Remember, purification offering, not sin offering. There's no sin involved in childbirth. Your purification offering, recognizing that there was a violation because blood has been spilled in the process of childbirth. So uncleanness. Then you have this idea of uncleanness through diseases that somehow, right, that the whole entire chapter 13 deals with how do you diagnose infectious skin disease, different kinds of skin diseases, and whether they are allowed. So if they are unclean, they are supposed to be treated a certain way. If they cannot be treated, if they cannot be solved, you have to burn it. Okay, because of the uncleanness. So there's a lot of purification. If the thing has been solved, you're supposed to purify the people. This is the sacrifice. This is the part where, if you remember in the gospel, Jesus healed someone of leprosy. And he told the person, don't need to tell people about it. Just go to the priest as a testimony. Because the priests are the one who will verify and testify that you have indeed been purified from your skin disease. So that was the one that Jesus was talking about. The last one is the uncleanness because of discharge. Because of discharge. And there's the difference between a normal and an abnormal discharge. And normal discharge is what you normally don't come out from you. A normal discharge will include things like, for example, discharge when you involve in sexual activity, discharge when you have a monthly period. All these are considered normal discharges. Either normal or abnormal. When there's a discharge that comes from you, it is considered unclean. And therefore, the whole idea here, this is very strange, this is very peculiar to the Leviticus instruction. One of the main reasons is because God wants to distinguish very clearly between sex and worship. If you read through your Old Testament, you notice a lot of pagan religion, whenever they have religious festival, it will almost always end up with sexual immorality. Almost always end up with sexual immorality, because in a lot of pagan religion and sexual activity is intertwined. So for that reason, God wants to be very clear. Remember, sex itself is not sinful, but you cannot mix it into a proper worship of God. God doesn't want the people of God to follow the patterns of the pagans. So there's this clear distinction to make sure it is separated. So when a person has sexual intercourse with his wife, by right, that very day, the couple, both of them will be unclean, and therefore they cannot enter the tabernacle. Okay, they cannot enter the courtyard of the people, the presence of God, until one day later. The whole idea is to separate the sexual activity with their worship. Okay, so this is something very interesting concerning the Israelite worship. But all these are about different ways that uncleanness can enter the community. You notice some of these are no fault of us. There's no reason. There's no like, okay, how do I control, right, whether a lady when will have her monthly menstruation period? But at the point in time, the issue is not about uncleanness. Remember, sin is about carelessness, not about uncleanness. Sin is about carelessness. So this whole idea about, because there are pollution that came from different ways, which is normal, everyday life, and therefore there's a need for purification. There's a need to purify the whole entire tabernacle. You imagine with me, right, the logic is this. Every time we violate, we bring pollution, we bring a purification offering, we bring it to the altar in the tabernacle. The logic of Leviticus is when you bring your purification, this is a little bit like modern day when we confess our sin, right? When you confess your sin, you bring your purification offering, whatever offering you bring, and you sacrifice the animal. The logic of Leviticus is whatever is unclean doesn't disappear. There is just a transfer. By sacrificing on the altar, what was unclean now from you will be passed on and will be left at the altar. So can you imagine, the more you bring, the more purification offering that you bring, the more uncleanness will be left at the altar and your tabernacle. So your tabernacle and your altar will accumulate the uncleanness of the community. That is the way the idea works. So in a way, it is very similar to our modern Christian idea that when we confess our sin, the sin doesn't disappear. It just gets transferred to the cross of Jesus Christ. There is just a transference. There's no way to eradicate it. It is just transferring. So the whole idea of atonement is, now that all this uncleanness is accumulated and left at the altar and polluting the whole tabernacle, there must be a way to clean it once and for all. And that comes the Day of Atonement. Once a year, the people of God must gather. This is one of the strictest festival together with Passover. If you don't appear on the Day of Atonement to watch this mega drama that only a few people are doing. Remember, at this whole entire Day of Atonement, you are not doing anything. You are just standing there and watching. Only the high priest and the priesthood is putting up this drama about what must happen so that sin and the uncleanness can be dealt with. And you're supposed to watch every single year. You cannot miss. Once you miss, you will be basically cut off from the community. That's how serious the Day of Atonement is. So in the Day of Atonement, there's a stage where you're supposed to prepare. The high priest will prepare himself. He will dress his right garment. He will prepare 2 goats. That's where the idea of the scapegoat comes from. They'll prepare 2 goats. One goat will represent the purification offering. He will represent Jesus Christ, who will have to die to bear the consequences of our sin. The other goat is the scapegoat, who is supposed to bring sin far away from us. It represents sanctification. So this whole preparation is done. Then there's this big festival about the Day of Atonement, where they will cleanse the tabernacle. This is the day, the book of Hebrews say, the high priest once a year will get to enter into the most holy place. This is the time, but first and foremost, before he even enters, the high priest will have to sacrifice a bull, a male adult bull. That's how big it is. Again, the whole idea is to symbolize that even the best, remember in the logic, right? The high priest is the leader among all the people. Even the best among us cannot enter God's holy presence. In fact, because he is the most prominent among us and he's going to enter into the most holy place, his sacrificial animal is the largest by far compared to all other animals. You'll be like, wow, even the best among us need to sacrifice this. What if one day I have to enter? There's no other. I mean, I will sacrifice an elephant or something. So the whole idea is to visually give people the idea, wow, he has to sacrifice such a big animal, and the sacrifice is simply to get him into the most holy place. Is to simply because you being the high priest, when you step into the most holy place, the holy of holies, your very presence has already violated the holiness of God. So the whole bull is to symbolize, okay, but you sacrifice that bull in order to take your place. So you enter into the most holy place, then there will also be a purification offering for the whole entire community. That is one of the goats. That is one of the goats. So the idea is he will sacrifice one of the goat, take the blood. This is the once in the whole year kind of event where the blood will enter the most holy place. They will take the blood and they will sprinkle on the holy seats to symbolize how God uses the blood of the goat to cover over. That's the meaning of atonement. Atonement actually means cover over. So when you think about Jesus dying on the cross, it is not right to think, I know there's a Bible verse that says that, but it's actually not right to say that God erases our sin. It is better to think of it as God uses a liquid corrector and cover over our sin. There's a big difference. When you erase something, no trace of it is left. But when you cover over, what you recognize is that there was something behind, but you no longer see it. You recognize there was a fault behind, right? If you look at a piece of paper, an exam paper with a lot of correction tape, you know there was a mistake, you just don't know what that mistake was. It's covered over. The word atonement simply meant cover over. God doesn't overlook. God doesn't just, okay, I don't care, I just take it, I don't know. God knows, but he chooses to use his blood to cover over, so that I know there was a sin, but I no longer see it. I cover over. So the blood of the bull and the lamb the goat is used to cover over the sin and the pollution of the whole community. They do it from the Holy of Holies, they do it at the holy place, all the different artifacts, and then they go out to the courtyard, they do it on the altar, do it on everything to symbolize the blood of the lamb being used to cover over every pollution in the tabernacle. So that was the idea. And if you notice how this is being described and you read the book of Hebrews, now you will understand why Hebrews stresses that Jesus did not sacrifice the bull. He did not need to. Because the high priest was not qualified to enter, he had to bring in two sacrifices, right? He has to bring in a bull and a goat. But Jesus being qualified, he simply walked into the Holy of Holies and use himself as the sacrificial goat, as the purification offering. He doesn't need to sacrifice for himself. He can bring himself, and therefore, because there's no need for sacrifice to sacrifice for himself, he can offer himself as the purification offering instead. And that's how Jesus entered the most holy place and used his blood to cover over us. And the last part deals with the scapegoat, the idea of scapegoat, where all the sin. So the idea is that the high priest will use two hands, put their hand on the horns of the animal to symbolize transfer. So the idea that, okay, I know that the purification offering has purified the tabernacle, but sin is still present among us. So take two hands, put onto the horn of the goat to symbolize we're now going to transfer as a desire, transfer all the sin, a practice, a presence of sin onto the animal, and what the thing will do. All the while, all this festival was done by the priesthood and the Levites. No one else does it. Everybody's watching. But this time round, someone from among the community will be arrowed. Okay? Your job, very simple. You have only one job. Bring this scapegoat as far as you can away from the community. You are not allowed to kill it, okay? But bring it as far away from the community as possible so that it can find its way back to the community. That is the idea of the purging of the presence of sin from among us, individually, corporately. It describes the desire from within that we are given that free control and say, hey, I've purified for your sin, but I give you this task that you are supposed to purge out sin from your life and from our community. How far should you purge? I will leave it to you, but your only goal is to purge it so far that sin can no longer find its way back into our community. There's only one job. Okay, so that's how it was done. But of course, later Jewish people decided to play cheat. They actually have a way out. They basically brought the sheep, the goat, right, to the cliff. Remember, they are not supposed to kill the animal, but they brought the scapegoat to the cliff. And then before they remove the blindfold of the goat, they just remove the blindfold and shout behind the animal at the same time. And goats being a very timid animal, he will just run forward and he will commit suicide. Okay, so he said, hey, I never do anything. He is the one who ran off the cliff on his own. Okay, but by right, you are not supposed to do that. Because the whole idea of this exercise is to put it onto the conscience of that young man who is doing this. How far is enough? This is like when you go to God, right? And God says, I want you to purge out the sin of lust in your life. And then you come to God and say, God, but how far should I purge it? How far should I take this purging of sin? And then God will turn back and ask you, enough so that it will never return. God will not draw lines for us. God will not say, okay, do this, don't do that. We like God to just say, don't do this, don't do that. And then once I kill it, I'm okay. God will instead say, you decide how far you want to bring this. But you have only one intention. Bring it so far. If your conscience allow you to just leave the animal there and go back home, that's where you should bring it. As far as you can, so that in your conscience you know that this sin has no way of finding its way back home. So that was the idea. It's a very beautiful picture of the justification of sin as well as the requirement of sanctification. One is on us, sanctification. One is on Jesus Christ. Jesus, being our purification offering, died and purified for us, but we are responsible to purge sin from among our communities. So the whole entire description of the atoning sacrifice especially basically teach us about the significance of uncleanness. Remember, uncleanness is not about sin. It is about the demand of God's presence. It is just a visual way for people to understand, okay, God just arbitrarily lays some requirement. If you want to come in, you have to do it this way. Okay? And then the question is, sin is simply being careless about those requirements. Remember, sin is not about being unclean. Sin is about being careless with God's requirements for His holy presence. God say, okay, if you want to come in, sure, you can come in. Just make sure you drink 2 cups of water before you come in. Okay, maybe that's what God requires. But the idea of sin is whether you take God's demand carefully when you come in. Or you just say, this is nothing, no big deal, and you just walk in. So sin is being careless with God's presence, okay, God's holy presence. So in that way, right, the whole concept of the whole entire Leviticus 11 to 16 find its culmination in the concept of the atoning sacrifice. And we know that this is very important to the Christian faith because Jesus is known as our atoning sacrifice. The book of Hebrews describes Jesus both as the great high priest, the person who can enter God's holy presence without anyone sacrificing, without anything sacrificing for him. He is the only one who could step into God's holy presence on his own. And he is also the one who can sacrifice himself as the purification offering. Only his blood is worthy enough to cover all the sins of the world. That's why the book of Hebrews emphasizes the scapegoat, the original purification offering has to be done once every year because the blood of the goat can never purify sin. But the blood of Jesus can. So these two ideas connect together to talk about the whole concept of the gospel. Why did Jesus have to die? Why did Jesus have to die? So the nature of atonement, at the end of the day, as we discuss this, remember there's always two parts to atonement. There's always two goats. One, atonement as substitution. God substituted for us on the cross. Jesus came and became our substitute. The goat came along and substituted the whole community and uses his own blood to cover over our sin. In the same way, Jesus came as our substitute and uses his blood to cover for the sins of the world. And yet, a lot of time we forget about the second part. There is two goats. Always remember, there is two goats. There is another part about atonement that deals with the cleansing of the community. There's the second goat that is now the responsibility not of the priest, but on the people. That we are responsible to bring the presence of sin so far away. Not just individually, but also as a community. We want to come together and help one another to bring sin so far away from our life and our community that sin should never find its presence among us. So as we wrap up this whole entire idea, you know that the whole entire sacrificial system that was being presented in the whole book of Leviticus, the first half, culminates on this Day of Atonement. The whole idea is to bring to crescendo that the need for atonement because of all these sacrifices, and then point the whole system towards Jesus. Sin is serious. God's holiness is serious. There's no way to deal with sin just by our sacrifices. And therefore, there must be a drastic action taken to cover over. The gospel is simply meaningless without the backdrop of God's holiness. The gospel of Jesus Christ is not just about Jesus loving us. It is about God's holiness that we violated and that we are helpless to overcome, and that God sent His very Son to take our place, to do something that we cannot, to deal with the very sin that we couldn't deal with, to pay the penalty we couldn't pay. And therefore, He now, in front of the screen for every one of us, now the ball is in your court. Now God will pass the scapegoat over to you and say, okay, you have one job. I have died for it. I have purged this. I have died and my blood has covered over the sin, but I give you one job. This is the scapegoat now I'm passing in your hand. You have one job. Bring it as far away from your life as possible so that it will never find its way home.